Hello everybody, I'm Iain and in this video I want to talk about the top 5 things that martial artists get wrong about self-defense. So the first one is using self-defense as the only valid measure of value. This is really problematic. There are loads of benefits to training the martial arts. There's loads of different reasons why people train in the martial arts. Fun, fitness, the joy of learning a skill, sport, historical interest, cultural interest, a whole mix, as well as the self-defense component. Now, if self-defense is the only valid measure that you'll accept, you ignore all of the other stuff. You ignore all of the benefits that you and others could get from martial arts training. The vast majority of what martial artists do does not have direct relevance to self-defense, but that doesn't mean it's not valuable. And if we just focus in on only the stuff that's valid for self-defense, we miss all of that value. The other problem is that people want to do all that stuff, but they're still wedded to this idea that self-defense is the only valid thing, and therefore they push things into that box, into the self-defense box, that were never intended to be there. Things that were designed for sport, fun, fitness, historical interest, cultural interest. The self-defense component is a very small part of what we do, and we shouldn't use it as the only valid measure of everything else that we do. So the next one is reinventing violence in their own image, and this is incredibly common. As Sun Tzu said, you need to know your enemy and you need to know yourself. When it comes to self-defense, most martial artists don't know their enemy. They don't understand criminal behavior, so they superimpose onto it. They assume that the criminal will act exactly like they act. So if you look at 99.9% of alleged self-defense tutorials, what you'll see kickboxers assuming criminals act like kickboxers, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys assuming criminals act like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys, karate guys assume that criminals act like karate guys. No martial art is immune from it. They all do it. The trouble is, of course, is criminals act like criminals. We have a specific problem and we need a specific solution to it. It's not enough that your techniques work against a practitioner of your own discipline, right? Whether it works is not enough. You need to ask, works for what? Because something that can work in one context can be suicidal and extremely dangerous in another context. So, for example, if you had a guy who came to you and said, I've decided I want to be really good at boxing, so I've taken up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we would acknowledge that that guy is an idiot. We'd say, no, your training needs to be specific. So if we're talking about self-defense training, of course we need a live component to that, but that live component should have practitioners act like criminals act. It should include dialogue, multiple opponents, the need to escape, the need to protect others. It's not enough to say, well, this thing worked in this context, therefore it'll work in all contexts. What they're doing there is they're not understanding the problem. And if you can't understand the problem, your solution is always going to be incorrect. So look out for it. It's a big one. Martial artists do it all the time. They assume that criminals will act like martial artists, specifically martial artists of their own style. And unfortunately, that's not the case. So the next one is a total failure to address legalities. Again, we see this one a lot. In fact, martial artists have lots of phrases that they think absolve them of the need to address legalities, which of course they don't. So one's like, it's better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. It's a false choice. Your choices aren't just prison or death, right? There are legal ways to defend yourself. They'll say things like, oh, well, you can't think about the law in the middle of a fight. You're quite correct. You can't. So you need to think about it in training and in practice so that your behaviors are likely to ensure that you don't experience legal trouble. It's no good to avoid the problem physically if you then find yourself losing a job, away from family and loved ones because you're legally in the wrong. You need to be aware of the law. Now, people can argue about whether the law is good or bad, but the law is what it is. And any good self-defense solution needs to work that into its training. We need to acknowledge the legalities. We can't simply ignore them. To give examples of how this would work. So if you take, I think it would be a fair thing to say that for one-on-one consensual fighting, MMA has the most rounded skill set, right? Because they punch, they kick, they wrestle, they've got everything in there. But that doesn't mean that MMA is a good solution for self-defense, and you often see this presented, and part of the reason is they ignore legalities. So think of what habit MMA training instills. competitively. So I'll give this example. Bang, 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 guy gets hit, he falls to the ground. The practitioner then jumps on top of him and continues to hit until the referee pulls him away. Now, if you do the exact same thing in self-defense, you could get a room full of witnesses that will swear you beat up an innocent guy. This may come as a shocker, but criminals lie. They're not good people, right? So you're defending yourself, the guy falls to the ground, you have conditioned the habit to jump on, bang, bang, bang. Then what happens is police show up, the guy, because he's a liar, tells everybody, it wasn't me, officer, it was him, ask everybody, they'll tell you what happened. Everyone then says, yeah, no, he was lying on the ground as this guy was punching him. Because it's a tactical mistake as well, because there could be more than one person, so you shouldn't commit to one person like that for self-protection, but it's a legal mistake. It's a legal error. So we need to make sure that when we're training, how what we do will be perceived is key, as well as what it is we actually did. There's lots to this. And to completely ignore it, to completely miss it, is a big problem. People say this, there's no rules in a street fight. And again, street fight's a bad term because it's not legal to fight in the street, right? It's legal to defend yourself. They are two very, very different things. But when people go, there's no rules in a street fight, they're wrong. They're wrong. They're wrong for using the term street fight, and they're wrong for saying there are no rules. There are rules, we call them laws. And if you get it wrong, you're going to go to prison. So we need to make sure that students are aware of what the laws are, they're aware of how their behaviour will be perceived by others, and therefore they develop the skills to avoid harm, not just physically, but also legally. Anything that completely ignores the self-defence law is a very poor solution to self-defence. So the next one is a complete failure to grasp the goal of self-protection. It's not fighting. It's not about winning the street fight. If you hear people talk about winning the street fight, they're committing the error we talked about earlier. They're superimposing their own goals and actions onto criminal behaviour. When two martial artists fight, then that's often what they're trying to do. Who's the best grappler? Who's the best puncher? Who's the best all-round fighter? They are trying to prove who's the best fighter. The criminal is not trying to prove who's the best fighter. They just want what they want. And there are more effective ways for them to achieve that through a square go, through a fight. They can use surprise, numbers, weapons, deception. They're way more effective tactics for the criminal, and they know that. So they're not looking for a fight either. You're not looking for a fight. That's not your aim. Your aim is to avoid harm. Now, some people talk about survival, but I think that's a bad definition too. Because if you end up on life support, well, you survived, right? If you end up in jail, well, you survived. Neither of those, I would say, are good outcome. Survival is not a good outcome. The outcome is to avoid harm, legally and physically. Now, as part of this, when we're still talking about the physical skill set, the fighting skills, right? We can put them to one side, although obviously there is some crossover, but one of the best ways we can avoid harm is we escape. Martial artists have a really bad habit. I find this infuriating because it's everywhere. You talk about escape and they equate it with running away, and they are not the same thing. There's loads of videos on YouTube why you shouldn't run away in a street fight. That massive error on error being compounded in thinking there. Escaping is a skill. You need to be able to use dialogue, deception, preemption, chaos and confusion. You need to understand the criminal's motivations and how do you take those motivations away from you when you escape. Maybe when you're escaping, you've got other people to protect, so how do you guide them away as well? These are all skills you should learn and practice as part of self-protection training. Escaping is a skill. It's not just the physical act of running. And to reduce it to that shows a fundamental lack of understanding about what self-protection is. So self-protection, that goal of it, is to avoid harm. And then from there you need to work back and say, well, what is the most effective ways in which I can avoid harm? And fighting to a conclusion, that's not the most effective way to avoid harm. So the final one, and it's a big one, is reducing the whole of self-protection down to just the physical. Martial artists are really bad at doing that. Even then, they get the physical part of it wrong, as we've talked about. That they push skills into the self-protection box that don't belong there. The skills that were designed for outfighting another martial artist in a consensual exchange. And they ignore the physical skills that have nothing to do with outfighting another martial artist, but you'd still need for self-protection. The ability to preempt, the ability to escape, the ability to protect others, the abilities to manage distance. All of these things a part of the physical part of self-protection, but are not part of fighting. But away from that, the physical side of it is just one small part of self-protection. You need to know about your personal security, the risks you like to face, how to keep your home safe, how to travel safely, what risks you and your family face, and how to mitigate them through behavior. Now, we're not talking about paranoia here either. It's because paranoia in itself can be harmful, and the aim of self-protection is to avoid harm. The idea is that the precautions we take are always commensurate with the risk, right? And in order to do that, we need to know what the risks are. We need to study criminal behavior. So I'll give an example. I recently taught a self-protection course for a group of women, and I'd say the average age would be 70. Right? So what I did there was I look at the statistics, I understand the type of crime that they're likely to face in the location with which they live, within their demographic. We talk about the personal security habits that they can adopt that are likely to keep them safe from this relatively low risk. So I'm going to reassure them about that again in order to avoid that paranoia. I didn't say, okay, girls, time to do some self-defense, put the gloves on, let's get in the cage and I'll show you what works. Right? The physical skills are not the be-all and end-all. They're not that effective, right? Especially for them, right? It's the non-physical skills that are more effective. You've always got to cater it to the group you're aiming at. For example, when I teach self-protection courses to young men, statistically, young men are far more likely to come to harm in and around places that serve alcohol. So we'll talk about that, the risks that they face and things they can do to mitigate those risks. For the women, it's, again, the most likely person that harm them is their partner, right? So we'll talk about the warning signs of abusive relationships, the dynamics of abusive relationships. Again, nothing to do with how to throw a punch or put on an armbar. It's a very, very different skill set. And because martial artists don't know that, right? And in some cases they don't know they know it. In other cases they know it, but they can't be bothered to learn it. Or they're trying to do this thing of present their martial art as self-protection. It all goes wrong. It all goes wrong, right? What they should be doing is concentrating on the actual nature of the problem and then the personal security behaviors that you can do to mitigate those risks, because they are way, way more effective than the physical skills of last resort. And again, go back to the first point. It's not to say that martial arts aren't wonderful. I am a lifelong martial artist. I enjoy everything about them. I enjoy the one-on-one fighting skills. I enjoy the history of it. I enjoy the fact that I'm nearly 50 years old and I'm in pretty good shape for a guy of 50, and that's thanks to the martial arts. I value all of that. But when it comes to the self-protection part of it, if we're claiming that we're going to teach that, we need to teach it properly. And for the reasons discussed in this video, the vast majority of martial artists don't. And I've said this many times, and I'll say it again, often the worst self-protection instructors are martial arts instructors, because they don't teach self-protection, they teach martial arts, and they think they're one and the same. They're not. So I hope you found that interesting, maybe even entertaining. I hope you found it thought-provoking, but above all else, I hope you find it useful. And there's a few ways that I hope people may find this useful. The first thing is if you are looking for self-protection training, make sure you find it. Don't settle for martial arts training dressed up as self-protection training. Hopefully the stuff we've talked about in this video will help you make a more informed choice. Now, to be clear, you may be training under a guy who could be an incredibly talented martial artist, an incredibly talented fighter, and they could still know diddly squat about self-protection. They are two different fields of study. So make sure you're getting the instruction for the thing that it is you truly want to learn. If you're a martial arts instructor who wants to teach self-protection, then do it properly. Do your due diligence. Do your homework. Don't pass off martial arts or fighting skills as self-defense or self-protection skills. Learn the full skill set. Learn about the law, the crime statistics, the criminal behavior. Learn all of that stuff. Learn the personal security stuff, because that's what you should be teaching. That's what self-protection is primarily all about. And if you're a martial artist watching this, I hope the message has come across loud and clear that self-defense is as valuable and as useful as that is. It's not the be-all and end-all of martial arts training. There are lots and lots of benefits through training in the martial arts, and we can enjoy them and benefit from them, and we should do that. We don't need to constantly drive everything towards self-protection, because when we do that, we don't do our martial arts well, and we don't do self-protection well either. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. I do hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be back with more soon. Okay, take care, everybody.